You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. Could shifting your relationship with time change how you experience life? Stay tuned to explore this intriguing concept. This episode contains adult subject matter and some listeners may be triggered by this content. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. In this episode, we dive into the fascinating concept of time-light therapy, exploring how releasing our attachment to the idea of time can radically transform our lives. By understanding that time is not just a dimension, but an energetic force created during moments of trauma, we uncover how this affects how we experience ourselves and the world around us. Time-light therapy helps dissolve these energetic imprints, allowing for deep healing and personal growth. Bryan Hubbard has an extensive and versatile background as a journalist, editor, publisher, and an author of 2 books, including Time-light and The Untrue Story of You. He is also publisher and co-editor of the international magazine What Doctors Don't Tell You, which is published in 9 countries. Bryan developed his unique time-light therapy after suffering from chronic depression for more than a decade. The radical therapy is now being trialed in a German psychiatric clinic, and its discoveries have already helped many thousands of people overcome the influences and traumas of their past. Let's meet Bryan Hubbard. Hi, Bryan. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because Heal Your Past is such an interesting topic for today's conversation, and I know we'll be diving into a very, very fascinating new modality. So welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Petra. It's a beautiful time to be with you here in the new year. Everyone wants to look at their past, resolve these issues, and start over. So, yeah, it's a great time to be doing this.
Absolutely. A good time for new beginnings, new perspective as we head into the new year. So, yeah, perfect timing for you to join me today. And for starters, Bryan, do you want to share a little bit about your own story and about your own journey? Maybe how that connects up with what you do today. And if you can, let our listeners know a little bit about what it is that you do today.
Surely, will do. Yeah, so time-light is a spiritual therapy. When you get to as old as me, you sort of don't care anymore what people think. It's the only virtue about being old, you don't care. And so I can proudly say that each and every one of us is a spiritual being and that we have an eternal soul. The tragedy, if you will, is that we've forgotten that. We don't know it anymore. But we are eternal souls. And time-light is, as I call it, a spiritual therapy because it is about rediscovering that essential eternal self that you actually are. And for me, it came about because I had suffered terrible depression as a young adult after I'd been abused as a small boy for about 6 years, which I suppose today would be called trauma. And I think everyone uses that term now, and the great work of people like Gabor Mate has really put the word on the map, and no one's frightened to talk about it now. So I suppose it was a trauma, but it didn't really feel like that to me at the time, nor in fact did it even occur to me that my abuse as a child had anything at all to do with my depression as an adult. But clearly there was a connection. The abuse, I should say, by the way, was psychological. And from the age of 2 to about 6 or 7, my father never spoke to me, but the only means of communication we had was him whistling at me, which didn't do a great deal for my self-esteem. And of course, it ends up as an adult being a barely functioning person, so much so that I really couldn't even do stuff like buy clothes for myself. I didn't really feel I deserved to have anything like clothes. Applying for jobs was hard. Yeah, so I was a semi-functioning human being, and I didn't really know why, and didn't particularly think about it because I just assumed, well, I guess that's how I am. And I think that's true for many of us. We have all sorts of kinks and issues in our lives, whatever they may be. Indeed, we have views of the world, such as the world is hostile, or I'm not good enough to be loved, or I can't do this job, or whatever it is. We all have something, right? And we sort of don't explore it too much. And we just assume, oh, well, I guess that's the way I am. That's just my view of life, or whatever it might be. And I was the same. And then from that, being a sort of semi-invalid human being, I then crashed into depression up to the point of wanting to commit suicide. And I really reached a crisis point because I thought this was crazy. I just didn't know why I was like that. And as I say, at this point, I still hadn't figured out it was because I'd been abused as a child. And you say, well, that's pretty weird. But actually, people don't make these connections. I don't think I'm that unusual. And as I say, the word trauma would never have come into my lexicon ever. I never would have thought, oh, yeah, I've been traumatized. In fact, I don't even use the term in timeline. I use a different term than trauma because I think it still has a lot of connotations that people don't really fully understand. Anyway, back to the story. Yeah, so I reached a crisis point, and there'd been a few clues along the way before I had the final breakthrough. One clue was my own father. And we had sort of made peace, I guess, when I was an adult. But he was 90 one day when I went to see him. Had really been a really healthy guy. And he even had a checkup, and his doctor said, you have the heart of someone 30 years younger. I mean, it's astonishing. I didn't even know he had a heart. But he had a heart of someone 30 years younger. So he's in good health, really, for a 90-year-old. Anyway, so I went to see him that day, and there he was in bed. And he said, I've just had enough. And I said, what do you mean you had enough? He said, I just had enough. Yet another of his strange moods. And I left, and my mother phoned me 3 days later to say, Dad has died. And I thought, wow, he really did have enough. And it's quite a weird thing. And it's not that unusual in old people to say they've had enough. Had enough of what? Well, I guess you've had enough of life. You've had enough of experience. It was a strange thing, but there you go. The second clue was when I read a book about ghosts, which is really weird because I wasn't that interested in the subject at all. But it was an interesting book because it was written by a guy called Ian Stevenson, who was a Canadian academic. And he sort of really risked his own chair by doing this research because the academics around him said, you can't do this work. He really was intrigued by it. He went to interview all sorts of people. And what was interesting about it was that nobody really wanted to be interviewed. This was very embarrassing and quite difficult. But the thing that came through in all these stories was it was all a case of unfinished business. And it was all about the missing will in the second cupboard on the left. There's a secret drawer and all this sort of stuff. Yeah. Loads and loads of stories. And indeed, every case, it was the missing. No one even knew the drawer was there. You press this button, drawer opens, there's the will. And usually when this resolution in life occurred, the ghost stopped appearing. And I thought, well, that's really weird as well, thinking about that first story about my father. And then this about ghosts. It's like unfinished business that somehow this time itself seems to inhabit us. Then it came crashing through. I had this amazing expression came into my head. I have no idea to this day where it came from, and you can put your own value on it. But that expression was, that to which you do not fully attend shall weigh you down. That to which you do not fully attend shall weigh you down. I thought, what the hell does that mean? And funnily enough, I mean, that was some years ago, but I still unpack that expression and still get richness from it. But that was the founding idea of Timelight. And from that, a few more transmissions occurred, such as the 3 time bodies. We're made up of 3 time bodies. And that was the end of it. That transmission over, work it out for yourself. You now do the work. And that's what happened to me. I spent 5 years working through this, my degree's in philosophy, which has absolutely no benefit to anyone other than teaching you to attack and question and to really take apart an argument. And that was a useful tool because it really did help me to test this. And I tested it in workshops and I developed it as I went along and all this sort of thing. And eventually I wrote a book. Well, I wrote two books, actually. The first was called Time Light, very unoriginal title. And the second one was called The Untrue Story of You, which was a Hay House book, which is still available at all good Amazons. And that really did outline the whole theory and behind Time Light. And you haven't even asked another question yet. Are you okay for me to carry on?
Absolutely. It's fascinating and it connects us to a little bit of the creation of Time Light and how that came about.
Well, for me, it's the discovery saved my life, I'd say. It saved my life. And it sort of made me realize that, because working through all this, I'll explain the structure of it in a minute, but it made me realize we've all been getting this round the wrong way. Whether it's depression, anxiety, social phobia, and not feeling good enough, inadequacy, etc., etc., etc. We've been looking at it the wrong way around. And the fundamental mistake that all of primarily Western culture has done is placing a self at the center who is an independent agent who makes decisions and choices. And this is false. It's a fiction. It doesn't exist. There's nothing there. But that is the basis of modern therapy, because what it says is, Bryan, and I would never drag you into this, Bryan has depression, anger problems, whatever it might be, okay? And therefore, Bryan has to fix this problem. But the problem is separate from Bryan. Bryan has anger problems. So we, as a therapist, and Bryan have to work on this together. And that's false. It's not true. The self that has anger issues or depression, whatever, is the same thing as the anger. And in fact, the self created by the anger, there is no difference at all. And only when you see that, there is nothing to resolve other than the transmission of time itself. Because what happens, time, I don't want to go too much into quantum physics stuff, but time actually does not exist. It's a man-made construct which we do to count change. That's time. And we do it because of the sun, we whirl around the sun and we spin on our axis, etc., etc. And we get day and we get night and the seasons, and we call this time. It's a measurement of change, but time actually doesn't exist. We created it. It's useful because you know how long the taxi driver's been late, but really it doesn't exist. The only time that actually does exist is psychological time. And that is created at the moment of trauma. Now, I say trauma, as I say, advisedly. I don't call it trauma. I call it a time-heavy experience. It's the moment when there is separation from self to the world. So if you go back to being a baby, the baby, and you can watch this, I see it with my grandchild, and it's fascinating. There is no difference between her and her parents. There is increasingly becoming so now, but in the early formative months, year or so, there is no difference at all. There is no difference between the self and a world. That separation starts to occur when there is trauma, when suddenly there's a split and the self is separate from the world. So now there is me and there is you. And when there is me and there is you as separate things, it opens the door to what we call experience. And when we have experiences, it reinforces that view of the world that we are starting to have, that somehow the world and you are separate from me. And that reinforces that vision, which is also false. There is no distinction at all between you and me and the world. It is the same thing because it is consciousness. But what we do is we create a false self from trauma, which then creates this being, this energy being that appears to be separate. But that is the beginning of all the tragedy and sadness of the world. And when you've done that, you also create, there are many, many, many selves. And one of the selves is the one that is driven by the trauma itself. So the fundamental function of therapy should not be to resolve the problem, but to change your relationship to time. That's the fundamental difference. So I'll stop there, have a glass of water, and you can ask me another question, okay?
Absolutely. Thank you for explaining this and laying this out for our listeners. And
it's what I'd call counterintuitive, because I think that we all walk around believing I am this separate agency that makes decisions, and we're actually not. But anyway.
yeah, and what a realization. It does become a little bit obvious at this point then why so many people might not have success with traditional therapy when they're encountering issues, because these are not things we talk about. These are not things we address.
With standard, I don't want to knock anything, because I think people got to do what they want to do, and if they resonate with that, well, great, do it. I think the problem, though, with a lot of therapists is that they achieve modification of behavior. And look, that's great. But if you're looking for fundamental change, if you're looking for a radical revolution of the psyche, which I think we should be, because we are spiritual beings after all, and we should be living as that rather than these isolated human beings, then I think you do have to look at it in a different way. And I would suggest Timelight is an interesting avenue to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you said that you received some transmissions and there was the 3 time bodies.
Okay. We need to talk about that?
Give us a little bit of an insight into what that means and how that ties into Timelight when we talk about it from a sort of therapeutic standpoint.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, it's all consciousness, but consciousness divides down into 3 time levels. The first is, of course, present time. But the key to that particular time body is that you are within it. It's not that you're I'm present here. You are within present time. Everything you see around you is present time. The planets, the animals, this table is all within present time. And so are you. You are within present time. Because the fundamental first law of Timelight is, of course, everything is energy. And so, oh, yeah, I'll get that. Yeah, Einstein, quantum physics, yeah. But they don't get it. You don't get it. If you really got that, everything changes. But you don't get that. But people say they do. But everything is energy. So anyway, so we start with present. Then when we have these experiences or trauma, let's start with experiences first. Then we'll come to trauma. We have experiences. So what happens is we learn, for example, that my name is Bryan because my parents keep saying it, although my father didn't for 6 years. But apart from that, I know my name is Bryan. So when they say Bryan, oh, that must be me. Now, that is a memory. That is a knowledge memory. It's knowledge. I learned that my name is Bryan. I learned that my parents are here. I learned that I live in this place, etc., etc. And this is knowledge I learn. And everything about the idea I know my name is Bryan is because I have a memory of it. Really, that's it. And we think, oh, no, it must be much deeper than that. And it really isn't. That's the first memory. The second memory you learn as you start to develop is you develop a narrative. And the narrative memory is all about the story. So the narrative is quite anodyne to begin with because it talks about who I am in relation to others and what I do. And, oh, yeah, and every Monday I have to go to school or whatever it is. There's a narrative story that building up. That is fairly anodyne until the psychological memory starts. And that is what happens when there is trauma or sadness or the separation, if you like. And I call that time-heavy experience. That's the psychological past. Now, when you have the psychological past, the narrative then supports the psychological because you will, any hurts or disappointments or indeed view you have of the world is endorsed by the narrative. And just as an aside, conflict is the fusion of narrative and psychological past. All war, conflict, argument, whether it's in Gaza, Ukraine, throughout history, is actually an act of memory. It really is. And that's, again, quite an interesting insight because I don't know about you, I travel around the planet and I see people, whatever they are, And all I ever see is human beings, wonderful human beings who smile and we hug each other and what have you. And that's the truth. That's the essence of who they are. They're not Jews or Arabs or whatever they might be, Ukrainians or Russians. There's just a human being. It's the memory of the psychological hurts coupled with the narrative which drives the psychological hurts, which is the home of conflict. That was an aside. The third self is the potential, which is the eternal self, which is not personal, but it is the eternal. It is the field of all possibility. And because we live our lives through the lenses of the past, we actually see the past around us. We are living in the past because that is the lens you've chosen to live through. And that is why you will keep on making the same mistake. You keep finding the wrong person in a relationship. You find someone who will abuse you because you were abused before. You will not make money because you've always believed you could never make money, etc., etc. And I invite the listeners to look at that, because do they have patterns in their lives? Second question, would you have chosen to have done that? I guess not. So thirdly, why is it happening? And the reason why it's happening, because you actually are the field of all potential. And you've chosen, well, it has chosen, the drive of the past has created that lens through which you live your life, which is why we have patterns. So there you are. That's the model. And they said, is that real? And I said, well, if I cut you open, it's not going to be there. It's a map. It's a map. It's just a useful way for you to see your own psychology. And it's a handy way of seeing things. And is it true? Well, sort of. But is a map true? Well, it's a representation of something. So I guess that's what that is. But it's a useful one. Then you can start saying, okay, because I invite people, okay, so you have basic things like I am hungry, I need shelter, basic human bodily needs are extended in time through the psychological time, so that I need food becomes I need to eat a 5-course gourmet dinner. I need accommodation becomes I need to live in a mansion. So there's all extensions of time from basic needs. So that's what goes on. Yeah, so this map helps you see that. That's really its function. And what is quite interesting is that when they've done studies of Alzheimer's patients and stuff like that, those 3 memory types, knowledge, narrative, psychological past, become apparent, because some people, even with some Alzheimer's patients, they actually forget the narrative, but are really good at remembering how to tie their shoe or drive a car or whatever it might be. Or they forget the narrative, or they remember the narrative, they forget how to do something. And this is actually becomes apparent in Alzheimer's patients as this stuff starts stripping away. And it becomes, oh, wow. It really, really pissed me off, because I did this book, and about 4 years afterwards, there was this massive study into Alzheimer's patients who did exactly the same thing. But they spent £2 million finding it out, and I got it for free. But it's true. You see it in dementia patients, you see it in Alzheimer's. Yeah, you suddenly see it falling away, and that's what's there. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. And the fact that this also happened to be part of the transmission that you received, this is absolutely fascinating.
By the way, I had another transmission when I was 16, and I didn't know what the hell to do with it, because I was meant to go to Oxford University. My father quite literally ripped up the thing in front of me and said, you're going to work. I went to work at the age of 16, and I missed out on university completely. And I was working in the office one day at 16, and there's enormous, but at the end of the day, everyone's gone home, and there was this enormous force, I just felt it, pushing against the window. Enormous force. And it said, you are time. And oh, geez, that's really frightening. I don't know. So I ran out of the room, shut the lights off, and went out the door. And I didn't know what to do with that. And it's almost like that voice came back years later in a similar way, but dressed it up a bit and made it more interesting. But in a way that I had both those visitations. And I think if I hadn't acted on this one, I think something was said, when the hell are you going to do anything about this? So I just felt I had to. Well, I had to for my own sake. Because I'd really reached a pressure point. There's nothing more miserable, but that's what depression is. And it's a dreadful thing. And you feel like you're in a real loop, and you just can't see a way out of it, And It's a terrible thing. But as I said, we are spiritual beings, and everything that happens to us, whether it's mental health problems or even physical problems, life problems, it's all a spiritual crisis because we're not seeing ourselves as we truly are. And that's what Time Light tries to do. Try to strip back the time so you become what you actually are, which is eternal or non-time.
That makes sense on the energetic level as well.
Right.
When we look at it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, can you give us a bit of an insight as to what a session, for example, might look like if someone wants to work with Time Light? Can you, without giving away your secret sauce or anything that you don't want to talk about, can you give us a bit of an insight on that? What would it look like?
I do workshops, and I also work with Lynn McTaggart, who's my wife, who's quite well known probably to some of your listeners through her intention work in Power of It. So I do some work with her. I've done courses separately from that. As I say, fundamentally, I'm not interested in the problem. I'm interested in time. Therefore, we don't look to fix the problem. We look to change the relationship with time. That means there's all sorts of things we do to help address that. They can be anything from, dumb things, if you like sort of doing something different every day. A little habit change is a good thing to do because it just makes you more aware. And there's also exercises we do about really understanding that. There's a little one I do where I invite people to really see their parents and their grandparents and the hope and expectation that came about with their own lives, their birth, meeting each other and falling in love, and how excited they were when you were born. And I invite people to explore that and to really go through that in great detail. And it's a sort of a beautiful way to introduce compassion. And my father was a hopeless father. The weird thing is he was doing the best he could as someone who is emotionally 5. And that's an important thing to understand, that he actually did love me as best he could. And it was tragically bad, but that was the best he could do. And that's the beginning of compassion. And it's also the beginning of healing. So that's a nice little exercise I invite people to do, as I do with true forgiveness. And true forgiveness is not forgiving the other person, but forgiving yourself for carrying the weight for as long as you have. Because we can't forgive somebody else, because I don't have that ability. But I can forgive myself for carrying the weight of time. Like my father carried the weight of time until he said, I've had enough. That's carrying the weight of time. It's the weight of time when the ghosts keep coming back. They can't be at rest. They can't be at peace. It's the weight of time of all the things that happen to us, whether it's trauma or disappointment. It's the weight of time that divides us from the world and others and makes us think they're separate. And that's the biggest challenge we all face, is overcoming time. Because if you overcome time, you overcome everything. And then you really do live a life that is joyful. It's just mind-blowingly wonderful. And to know that I am an eternal soul and this whole world and everything about it is an utter miracle. And people just can't see that, because when you're depressed or anxious, or you can't see this stuff. And to know that that actually is the truth, it's a great place to be. It really is. It is, as I say in the book, it is coming home. But you have to come home. If you draw the story of the Garden of Eden, which they left the Garden of Eden because they started to know. They took from the tree of knowledge. And you have to come back to the Garden of Eden as knowing people. And the only way back through the Garden of Eden, back to heaven, is through hell. Because if you think you are separate and everyone is separate from you, you're in hell. You actually are in hell. And heaven is realizing that was never the case. And that's love, because love is the opposite of separation. And it's not hate, it's separation. And people live very isolated and sad lives because they are separated. And that's so sad. It's a tragedy of the human being. But I think it's a necessary tragedy. I think it's all necessary that we then know this and can return to that place, but as knowing beings. Got a bit heavy there, didn't we? Sorry about that, Patra.
As you're saying that, I feel there's a sense of empowerment and liberation in what you're talking about for people who are suffering or they're dealing with illnesses and a lot of sadness and pain in their lives.
It's interesting because people haven't seen it that way before. And when you do see it that way, and you are close to getting that, for whatever reason, you may be spiritually advanced, you didn't know it or whatever, or just really feel like you've had enough of this wretched life, which is wretched until you know it's not. What I say can be revelatory, and people do actually wake up. And that can happen. That happens to a few. They actually do wake up. And for the rest, we just do the work. It's really cool, isn't it, to actually have a map? That's cool because you're saying, okay, I can see where we are and see where I've got to go. And that makes it all possible. And the things that you have to do. And I mean, I always do the little, every session begins with the time-like meditation, because that's important. We do that because you have to be, when you're meditate, you're highly intelligent and you're acutely aware. You are very aware of everything. Hopefully you are. And that's the perfect time to really then look at this, to really explore this. And it's exciting because if you're saying, wow, it's a bit like taking a coat off and putting it on the hook, and we're all looking at the coat, but that coat is what you thought you were, but it wasn't. Now we hang out, now we all look at it together, and we say, well, isn't that interesting? And that's what this is. Well, this is quite. So, and then one of the little, you said what things we do. I mean, one of the little experiments we do is saying, okay, if you've got all these selves, and we are thinking all the time, where do you think this thought came from? Because we think, I think, well, you don't think. One of the koans of time, like the thought thinks the thinker. There is an energy which creates an emotion. The emotion is almost immediately turned by the brain into a thought, and then you think it, and that thought creates the thinker, because you couldn't possibly have a thought without a thinker. It would be a nonsense. In the same way that when you have an emotion like a seriously angry outburst, I don't know if you've ever been that angry when they say you see red. And when you're really that angry, it's only after the fact, and I'm talking about a second, but it's after the fact that someone owns it. That anger then creates a self that says, oh, I was angry, and then will do one of two things. They usually would justify it, which is the narrative self coming into it. Or if you're a bit more advanced, you say, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean that. But normally we justify it. But that comes after the fact. So the thought thinks the thinker, the emotion creates the feeler. And you start seeing it that way. So it's all still great fun. You know, I've given you a toolbox here, guys. Play with it. And there's nothing personal about this. There's nothing personal about life because there's no one there. So you don't feel that you're under attack in any way, because you're not. This has nothing to do with you. These are these remnants of energy that are time, that are coursing through you and creating your life and creating you. And let's sit back and look at it together and have a bit of fun, because that's really what it is. And all we're going to do is just change your relationship or a relationship to it. And when you do that, it changes. Because Lynn said, oh, you've got to do lots of exercises, which I do, but the fundamental exercise is seeing it.
Creating that awareness.
Do you get that? When you see it, the work has started, the process has started.
Yeah.
And you can't go back. Because now what I've told you and told your lovely listeners here on New Year is something you can't quite, well, some people could say, well, I'm a madman. And there you are, problem solved. But if I'm not a madman, you sort of have to think about it and look at it. And this is the point. It's not a case whether I'm a madman or anything else. The point is, if I've said something, why don't you find out? Test it. That's the point. Test it for yourself. Don't believe me, but test it. Maybe use my little map to have fun with it. A New Year's fun thing is that I'm going to try Time Light for 30 days and see my New Year's resolution and see what happens, and start playing with, where does that thought come from? Because it's going to come from present, or it's going to come from narrative. It's going to come from knowledge, or it's going to come from psychological parts, or it's going to come from the potential. And it's going to be one of those places. And because we've forgotten that we are spiritual beings, we seek enormous compensation in what is seen as material. There's no such thing as material, but we seek that because we have forgotten who we are. So therefore, I have never yet met a multimillionaire who's ever said to me, I've got enough. Never happens. Every single multimillionaire I've met, and I've met quite a few, always wants that extra million. Why? Because that extra million might just do it. The other 20 in the bank, no, not really. But that extra million might just get me there. Get you where? Get you to this sense of wholeness because I've forgotten I'm a spiritual being. And it isn't going to do it. And whether it's a new car, a bigger mansion, a more beautiful wife, a more handsome husband, a better meal, tra-la-la, ain't going to do it. It does it for about 10 minutes. And then you say, oh, that's pretty boring now. I need something more. I need another kick. That's the other thing. And what if you don't go for the Mercedes, what do? You start taking drugs. You start drinking too much booze. Or you become an addict in another way, because we're all addicted to sex, to shopping, to whatever it might be, because that might fill the hole. That hole that says actually you're a spiritual being when you're going to wake up to that, we hope that will fill it, because I can't face that. I don't know that I'm that. And that is interesting about addiction and depression. Part of the idea is that there is a common theme to the two. It's not always the case. I don't want to say, well, therefore it's always the case. It's not. But some is again worth exploring here in the new year, is possibly depression and addiction have the same root. And that root is that there was a time when I knew life was better. And addiction is a way to try to bring that moment back somehow, either because at that moment when I knew there was something better, I was doing something, and I therefore would do the thing again in order to replicate that experience, which never happens. Or I just want to escape from where I am, because where I am isn't really where I want to be. And that's addiction. And depression is a similar theme, that when I was depressed, I sort of knew that life somehow was better. Sometime I sort of knew it somehow it was better, and I just didn't know what to do. And it was just that quiet voice, the soul saying, well, yes, of course it's better. You are this astonishing thing and you've forgotten. And I think that's depression. And as I say, look, it's not true in every case. I don't want to say that. I don't want to say every case it's this. It never is. But it is an interesting observation, and I think it's one worth looking at and seeing if that's true for you. Because when you look at the three model self, it's a useful tool, because if you have, I know a lot of your listeners also have health issues, not just mental issues. If you go through the three bodies to look at the health problem, so you start with the present, and the present says, look at what you're eating, look at your environment, look at pollutants, look at all these sorts of things. Look at your immediate relationship with people. Look at whether community is so important. Are you isolated? This is a present thing. So you start there. You always start there. What is immediately apparent? If you're living next to a chemical plant, maybe that's why you got cancer. So you need to do something about that. Or your diet is just trash. You need to change your diet. And if you've cleaned all that sort of stuff up and you're leading a good life in that sense, and you have friends and community, great. Then you go to the next level down, which is the psychological. You look for the trauma, because there's an enormous, medicine is finally getting that body, mind are connected. And that trauma can be expressed as disease. And so you've got to look at that. You've got to start healing that. And if that seems okay, that you're denying yourself, because you are this amazing creative being, why aren't you being that? And if you're blocking that, then that can also be a cause of physical ailments. And there's a great guy we used to work with, because we also produce a magazine called What Doctors Don't Tell You. And we used to work with a great cancer specialist called Bernie Siegel. And he used to invite people to finally say, look, you got cancer. This is not great. Maybe it's time you finally did what you really wanted to do with your life. Whether you always wanted to be a painter, you always wanted to do ballet, you always wanted whatever it was you wanted to do. Do it. Do it. And when people did, then believe it or not, cancer started to recede. Look at it that way. That's a useful model too for people with physical ailments. Try the 3-part approach to that. It works for that too. That's useful. Yeah. Anyway.
Thank you for sharing that. I love that approach, actually. And as you're speaking about that, my wheels are turning. So I'm sure this was very helpful for the listeners as well to have that exploration. And Bryan, how can our listeners connect with you if they found this episode inspiring or they'd like to know more about Timelight? What kind of things do you offer as far as therapy or certifications, programs? What do you have available?
Various things. I mean, first go to the website, which is time-light.net. So do that. Then you can sign up for emails. There's a whole lot of stuff on the site, loads and loads of bits and pieces and great pearls of wisdom, Patrick. I also run several courses, so people can download those and watch those. But I suppose really I'm getting to the point now where I really want to train people, such as life coaches, therapists, whatever they might be, who might be intrigued by Timelight and would like to add it to their tool chest. I'm not suggesting abandon what you're doing, but add it, include it, so that if you are having people who you're not making much headway with, maybe, and you become a certified Timelight practitioner, well, something else you can try. Yeah, so that's really probably the path I want to pursue more. So if there are any listeners who are therapists, life coaches, or would be interested in practicing Timelight and teaching it to others and helping people, then again, just let us know and we can follow up with that. I mean, there's all still in sort of early stages right now. It's something I need to focus more on, prepare more for. But people put their hands up, at least I know, okay, I need to start doing this stuff. But I think that's the way to go, because I think for me, I'm a journalist, I'm a researcher, and I suppose I want to, rather than spend all my time teaching this to individuals, I want to do more research and explore it more. I think there's more to do with this, and the more people do it, the more data I get back, the more insights I have, the richer it becomes. So that's what I ideally like to do. But I think there's the book as well, The Untrue Story of You, Hay House, and that's available. Yeah, I mean, that was done a little while ago, but it's still pretty current. It's still, it's obviously the philosophy and the theory and the ideas have moved on a little bit, but really fundamentally it's there. But yeah, so come to the website, sign up, read the book, talk about it, try it out, think about it, and see if it makes sense. And even if it tickles your fancy, that's a good English expression, tickle your fancy, then give it a go. Try a few of these ideas out. Try to look at yourself in this way about the three bodies, about all this. Play with it. Don't feel vulnerable about this, because that is a fiction. It's a fiction, honestly. And it is just the thing itself. It is the energy that's released from the trauma that is living your life, that is creating a you, that is in the world. And then just to say about trauma for a moment, because things like field therapy are quite cool, because about tapping, and the idea of trauma being trapped in the body, which is true, it is. But if you actually think, well, hold on a minute, if the present self is everything that I can see and taste and experience, and I'm just in this present time, then trauma is in the world. Trauma is in the world. So the first thing we must do as responsible human beings is change ourselves, because then the world changes. And it's a heck of a responsibility. There is nobody else anyway, so you better get on with it. So yeah, trauma is in the world. And if anyone doubts that, read a newspaper or watch the news and tell me that it's not.
Good point on that one.
Anyway, so yeah, come to the website, sign up, and read the book if you want, and stay tuned, and we'll be back in touch with you.
Sounds wonderful. And we will be linking to all of Bryan's offerings in the show notes as well. So be sure to check there on how you can get in touch. And if any of the listeners end up working with you as practitioners or getting certified in Timelight, definitely reach out and let us know. I'm always so curious what happens when our listeners connect with our guests and the magic that happens when that comes together. So reach out to us on the podcast here and let me know what your experience has been like. And I would love to hear some of the listeners who have added Timelight to their tool chest, like you said, Bryan, and what their experiences have been. And yes, stay tuned. I'm sure there'll be more to come on that. So thank you so much, Bryan, for being here today and spending this time with me and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with our listeners and with myself on this topic. It has been an absolute privilege to host you here today. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Patra. And Happy New Year to everyone. Now we got some tools to make sure it is going to be a Happy New Year.
Yes, a great new start for the 2025 coming up. So thank you for that, Bryan, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejorni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.